Welcome to the Bible, Your Biography podcast. I'm Lynna K Teer, spiritual mentor and teacher. This podcast is devoted to uncovering the hidden psychological and mystical structure of Scripture. Here we explore the Bible, not as history, not as doctrine, and not as external theology, but as sacred symbolism, revealing the pattern unfolding within man. Through the interpretive lens of Neville Goddard and through lived experience, we examine the names, numbers, generations, dreams, and prophetic imagery as states of consciousness. The Bible is not about someone else, it is about you. In this episode, we are exploring the hidden wisdom of biblical symbolism and why Scripture must be understood psychologically if it is to be understood at all. The Bible is not merely a historical document. It is not simply a moral code. And it is not a book about distant figures who lived thousands of years ago. It is a structured revelation of consciousness awakening to itself. And that shift in perception changes everything. So let's begin at the foundation. There was a time when I read Scripture literally. I believed the events were historical, the characters external, and the message primarily moral. I believed what I heard, what I was taught in the church. And to be clear, many people begin there. Literal reading is not wrong. It is simply the surface layer. But something began to change when I experienced my spiritual awakening. Mystical dreams began to unfolding. Symbolic imagery appeared in ways that I could not ignore. And certain biblical scenes began replaying themselves internally, not as imagination, but as lived inner experience. There was this recognition, this remembrance happening. And verses began to illuminate themselves without effort, meaning, as I read Scripture, the symbolic meaning, the symbolic nature of Scripture, the true meaning of Scripture, certain verses began to reveal themselves to me. So Scripture began to feel less like study and more like recognition. And this is an important distinction. Recognition feels different than learning. It carries familiarity with it. What Neville Goddard taught about the Bible being psychological was no longer theoretical to me. It was experiential. The symbolism became unmistakable. The Bible was not describing ancient history. It was describing the structure of awakening within consciousness. And once that shift occurred, I could never return to reading it the same way again. So that is the threshold that we are crossing in this episode. Neville emphasized repeatedly that the Bible is psychological, not metaphorical in a loose sense, and not poetic exaggeration, psychological. Every character represents a state of consciousness. Every location symbolizes a mental condition. Every event reveals an internal shift. When read through this lens, Scripture organizes itself in two primary movements. The Old Testament reveals unawakened man living under the law. The New Testament reveals awakened man fulfilling the promise. This is not theology, it is structure. The Old Testament describes life when God appears external. The New Testament describes life when God is recognized as internal. And here's what happens when awakening begins. Scripture feels familiar. You begin to see your own patterns mirrored in the text. You're not reading about someone else, you are reading about yourself. That is when the Bible becomes autobiography. So let's move deeper. The Old Testament represents a stage of consciousness where man believes God is outside of himself. This stage is governed by obedience, ritual, fear, striving, and perceived separation. Symbolically, I'll give you guys a few definitions. So, symbolically, Egypt represents bondage to limited identity. The wilderness, and keep in mind, these also represent states of consciousness. So Egypt being bondage to a limited identity. The wilderness is a state of consciousness that represents mental wandering and instability. The law represents external authority. And sacrifice represents a belief that approval must be earned. So pause for a moment and reflect. How often does the unawakened mind seek validation externally? How often does it measure worth by performance? And how often does it believe circumstances control identity? That is the Old Testament states of consciousness. Neville described this stage as life before the discovery of I am. In this phase, God appears separate, man seeks approval, identity is tied to action, fear governs behavior. Even the prophets carry symbolic meaning. They represent intuition rising within unawakened consciousness. The inner voice attempting to pierce through the illusion of separation. And remember, prophets were just teachers. The Old Testament is not obsolete. It is the early psychological stage of awakening. It is you before recognition. Now here's where the narrative shifts. Every spiritual journey contains a turning point, a moment where external seeking begins to collapse, a moment where ritual feels empty, a moment where the question arises internally, what if God is not outside of me? That shift marks the movement from the law to the promise. And this is where the New Testament begins symbolically. The New Testament does not begin with a political revolution. It begins with a birth, a spiritual birth. The birth of Christ symbolizes the birth of unawakened awareness within the individual. Christ represents divine imagination, the recognition that the I am is God. The crucifixion symbolizes the death of false identity. The resurrection symbolizes awakening into true identity. The ascension symbolizes integration of higher consciousness. Neville spoke often of what he called the promise. The promise is not a reward. It is not earned through moral behavior. It is revealed through mystical experience. It is a realization that the one spoken of in Scripture is the awareness listening to these words. The Father and I are one, not symbolically, experientially. And this is where many misunderstandings arise. Spiritual awakening can occur in stages, but the fulfillment of the promise is specific. It is direct recognition of divine identity. The New Testament encodes that awakening. Now, let's slow it down. Symbolism cannot be mastered intellectually. I'm going to say that again. Symbolism cannot be mastered intellectually. It must be lived. It must be experienced. As consciousness expands, dreams become symbolic instruction. Scripture feels autobiographical. Characters reflect inner states, and events mirror psychological transformation. Neville taught that the Bible must be fulfilled in man, not reenacted historically, fulfilled psychologically. When this understanding dawns, Scripture becomes alive. It ceases to feel distant. It becomes intimate. It speaks directly. And here is something important. Symbolic understanding does not remove reverence. It deepens it. Because now the text is not describing something outside of you. It is describing your own unfolding, your own spiritual awakening, your own movement from bondage to freedom, to spiritual awakening. So to understand biblical symbolism is to understand the language of consciousness itself. So let's examine a few symbols more deeply. And as I mentioned previously, Egypt is a state of consciousness that represents bondage to limited identity. Jerusalem represents peace and integration. So you go up into Jerusalem, you go up into the imagination, which is God, your divine identity. The Red Sea represents crossing from the old identity into expanded awareness. Mountains symbolize elevated states of consciousness. The temple represents the body and inner awareness. Nothing in Scripture is random. Numbers encode structure. Generations encode progression. Names encode psychological qualities. And most importantly, God is not an external being intervening from afar. God is I am. The awareness listening to these words. This is why Scripture is called the Word. It is revelation of identity. You may ask, why does this interpretation matter? Because literal reading keeps God external. Symbolic understanding reads or returns God to consciousness. When God is external, you plead. When God is internal, you assume. When God is external, you fear. When God is internal, you recognize. This is the psychological shift Neville emphasized. And this shift changes how you live. It changes how you interpret events. It changes how you relate to desire. It changes how you understand suffering. Everything becomes state-based, meaning states of consciousness. Everything becomes internal. If this perspective sounds new to you, begin gradually. When reading scripture, ask yourself, what does this represent in consciousness? And journal your dreams. Notice repeating symbols. Observe your states of consciousness. Study the lectures of Neville Goddard. And do not force understanding, because symbolism unfolds progressively. It reveals itself as awareness matures. And this is not about intellectual mastery. It is about inner recognition. So let's bring this full circle. The hidden wisdom of biblical symbolism is not hidden to exclude you. It is hidden because it can only be recognized through spiritual awakening. The Old Testament describes a journey under the law. The New Testament describes fulfillment of the promise. Both describe the pattern unfolding within man. Scripture is sacred psychology. It is the story of God awakening in man, awakening in humanity. And when you begin to see that pattern unfolding within yourself, the Bible is no longer distant. It becomes personal. It becomes intimate. It becomes your true divine biography. So, thank you so much for listening to the Bible, Your Biography podcast. If this episode resonated with you, continue the exploration. Study the lecture summaries available at NevilleGoddardOfficial.com or at the Neville Goddard lectures. If you are listening to the podcast episode on one of the podcast platforms or on YouTube. And then explore deeper reflections on both the law and the promise and this journey of the pattern of scripture unfolding within man. I dive into more content on my blog at LynnaKTeer.com. The name of the blog is The Journey of Awakening. And here on the Bible, Your Biography, we will continue unfolding scripture, meaning diving deeper into the symbolism of scripture as sacred psychology and symbolic autobiography. So if you found value in today's episode and would like to subscribe or leave a review and then share it with someone who is ready to see the Bible differently. If you are on your own journey of awakening, if you are drawn to Neville Goddard's lectures, there is no accident. There's nothing random in this world. So subscribing here and listening more to about the unfolding of this pattern within you, within all of humanity, may illuminate some of the experiences that you may be having, whether they be dreams or mystical experiences or even physical experiences you may be going through on your own spiritual awakening journey. So remember that the story of the Bible, all the stories in Scripture, they are not distant. the pattern is not external. The awakening is unfolding within you. I'm Lynna K Teer, and I'll see you in the next episode.